First Amendment, Freedom of Expression, 1791. The First Amendment protects 5 fundamental freedoms: religion, speech, press, assembly, and petition. It prevents the government from establishing an official religion or restricting religious practice, protects your right to express ideas and criticize the government without punishment, ensures journalists can report on government without censorship, allows peaceful protests and gatherings, and lets citizens petition for changes. These freedoms form the foundation of American democracy, though they have limits like true threats, incitement to violence, and defamation. The amendment only restricts government action, not private consequences. Second Amendment, Right to bear arms, 1791. A well-regulated militia, being necessary to the security of a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. For most of American history, this was interpreted as protecting state militias. In 2008, the Supreme Court ruled it protects an individual's right to own firearms for self-defense, though governments can still regulate who owns guns, where they're carried, and what types are available. This remains one of the most debated amendments in modern America. Third Amendment, No Quartering of Soldiers, 1791. This prevents the government from forcing you to house soldiers in your home without consent during peacetime, or without legal authorization during war. It was a response to British soldiers being quartered in colonists' homes. This is the least litigated amendment because the situation rarely occurs, but it reflects the principle that government cannot commandeer private property without due process. Fourth Amendment, Search and Seizure, 1791. This protects against unreasonable searches and seizures, requiring law enforcement to obtain warrants based on probable cause before searching your person, home, or belongings. British colonial officers used general warrants to search at will, which the founders found intolerable. Modern technology has created new Fourth Amendment questions about cell phone data, emails, GPS tracking, and surveillance. Police generally need warrants to search phones and track vehicles, though many exceptions exist. Fifth Amendment, Rights of the Accused, 1791. This provides 5 protections. Serious federal crimes must be charged by grand jury. You can't be tried twice for the same crime after acquittal. You can't be forced to testify against yourself. The government must follow fair procedures before depriving you of life, liberty, or property. And the government must pay just compensation when taking private property for public use. The right to remain silent and Miranda warnings come from this amendment, fundamentally shifting the burden to the government to prove guilt. Sixth Amendment, Right to fair trial, 1791. Criminal defendants have the right to a speedy and public trial, an impartial jury, to be informed of charges, to confront witnesses against them, to obtain witnesses in their favor, and to have legal counsel. If you can't afford a lawyer, one must be appointed for you, creating the public defender system. These rights ensure the government must prove its case against defendants who can meaningfully defend themselves. Seventh Amendment, Civil trial by jury, 1791. This guarantees jury trials in federal civil cases involving more than $20. Unlike criminal cases, you're suing or being sued for money rather than facing punishment. The jury decides facts while judges decide law. This hasn't been applied to state courts, and many civil cases now settle before trial or go to arbitration. But the right remains for cases that do go to trial. Ninth Amendment, Unenumerated Rights, 1791. Just because a right isn't specifically listed in the Constitution doesn't mean it doesn't exist. This clarifies that people possess fundamental rights beyond those explicitly mentioned. The Supreme Court has used this reasoning to protect rights like privacy, though it rarely relies directly on the Ninth Amendment. The tension is between protecting unlisted fundamental rights versus judges inventing rights based on personal preferences. Tenth Amendment, States' Rights and Federalism, 1791. Powers not delegated to the federal government belong to the states or the people. This is the cornerstone of federalism, preventing federal tyranny by keeping most power at the state level. However, broad interpretations of federal powers, especially the Commerce Clause, have weakened this amendment over time. it still prevents the federal government from forcing states to enforce federal laws. 11th Amendment, State Sovereign Immunity, 1795. This grants states immunity from being sued in federal court by private citizens without the state's consent. It was passed after states feared being bankrupted by lawsuits over Revolutionary War debts. Exceptions exist. States can consent to be sued, Congress can override immunity under the 14th Amendment, and you can sue state officials to stop ongoing constitutional violations. This protects state treasuries, but can frustrate people with legitimate grievances. 12th Amendment, Electoral College Procedure, 1804. Electors now cast separate ballots for president and vice president, whereas originally whoever came in second became vice president. This created chaos in 1800 when Thomas Jefferson and Aaron Burr tied, requiring 36 ballots in the House to resolve. The amendment ensures president and vice president run as a ticket. It didn't fix all electoral college problems like winners losing the popular vote or the disproportionate influence of swing states. 13th Amendment, Abolition of Slavery, 1865. This permanently abolished slavery everywhere in the United States, except as punishment for crime. It was the first Reconstruction Amendment, ratified after the Civil War to end the institution that had nearly destroyed the nation. However, the exception for criminal punishment led to convict leasing systems that effectively re-enslaved freed blacks, and mass incarceration today disproportionately affects Black Americans, with prison labor continuing under this exception. 14th Amendment, Citizenship, and Equal Protection, 1868. This is one of the most important amendments. It establishes that anyone born in the U.S. is a citizen, overruling Dred Scott. It prevents states from depriving persons of life, liberty, or property without due process, protecting fundamental rights like privacy. Most importantly, the Equal Protection Clause requires states to treat people equally under law. This was used to strike down school segregation, protect women's rights, legalize same-sex marriage, and prohibit various forms of discrimination. It fundamentally transformed the Constitution from primarily limiting federal power to protecting individual rights against all government. 15th Amendment, Voting Rights, 1870. The right to vote cannot be denied based on race, color, or previous condition of servitude. This was intended to secure voting rights for freed male slaves. However, Southern states used poll taxes, literacy tests, violence, and other tactics to prevent Black people from voting for nearly a century. Only the Voting Rights Act of 1965 began to realize this amendment's promise, though voting rights remain contested today with debates over voter ID laws, early voting restrictions, and gerrymandering. 16th Amendment, Income Tax, 1913. Congress can tax income without apportioning it among states based on population. This overruled a Supreme Court decision and enabled the modern income tax system. Before this, the government relied mainly on tariffs, initially affecting only the wealthy. Income tax expanded dramatically during the World Wars and is now the federal government's largest revenue source, funding everything from defense to Social Security and enabling the growth of the federal government. 17th Amendment, Direct Election of Senators, 1913. Senators are now elected directly by the people rather than chosen by state legislatures. The original system was plagued by corruption and deadlocks. This democratized the Senate, making senators accountable to voters rather than state politicians. Critics argue it weakened federalism by eliminating state government's direct voice in federal legislation. But direct election is now thoroughly embedded in American democracy. 18th Amendment, Prohibition, 1919. This banned the manufacture, sale, and transportation of alcohol for beverage purposes. Driven by the temperance movement and World War I anti-German sentiment, Prohibition was a massive social experiment and spectacular failure. Drinking went underground, organized crime flourished, gang violence increased, corruption was rampant, and government lost tax revenue. It did reduce alcohol consumption somewhat, but The costs were deemed too high. This is the only amendment completely repealed, serving as a cautionary tale about constitutional social engineering. 19th Amendment, Women's Suffrage, 1920. The right to vote cannot be denied based on sex. After over 70 years of struggle by suffragettes, this granted women the right to vote, doubling the electorate. The movement began at Seneca Falls in 1848, and activists were arrested and force-fed during hunger strikes. World War I was a turning point as women contributed to the war effort. However, black women in the South still faced discriminatory barriers until the Voting Rights Act of 1965, and full voting rights for all women required additional struggles. 20th Amendment, Presidential Terms and Succession, 1933. This moved presidential inaugurations from March 4th to January 20th, and congressional sessions to January 3rd, reducing lame duck periods where defeated officials remain in power. Originally, 4 months passed between elections and inaugurations, creating problems during crises like the Great Depression. It also clarified succession if the president-elect dies before inauguration. This modernized government, speeding up the democratic process so the people's choices take effect more quickly. First Amendment, Repeal of Prohibition, 1933. This repealed the 18th Amendment, ending national prohibition after 13 years of failure. It's the only amendment that repeals another. States were allowed to remain dry if they chose, and some counties stayed dry for decades. Ratified by state conventions rather than legislatures, it restored the legal alcohol industry, provided tax revenue during the Depression, and demonstrated that even profound constitutional changes can be reversed when they prove unworkable. 22nd Amendment, Presidential Term Limits, 1951. No person can be elected president more than twice. George Washington established a two-term tradition, followed by every president until Franklin Roosevelt won third and fourth terms during World War II. After FDR died in 1945, Republicans pushed this amendment to prevent future presidents from serving as long. It prevents power concentration and encourages renewal, though some argue it's undemocratic to prevent voters from choosing experienced leaders and that second-term presidents become lame ducks. 23rd Amendment, D.C. Voting Rights, 1961. Washington, D.C. residents get electoral votes in presidential elections equal to the smallest state, currently 3. Before 1961, D.C. residents couldn't vote for president despite living in the capital and paying federal taxes. However, this only addresses presidential elections. D.C. residents still lack voting representation in Congress, with only a non-voting House delegate and no senators, despite having larger population than some states. Fourth Amendment, Abolition of Poll Taxes, 1964. The right to vote in federal elections cannot be denied for failure to pay poll taxes. Southern states used these fees to disenfranchise black voters and poor whites after the 15th Amendment. The Supreme Court later extended the prohibition to state elections. This established that voting rights cannot be conditioned on wealth, though modern debates about voter ID laws echo poll tax concerns. 25th Amendment, Presidential Succession and Disability, 1967. This clarifies that the vice president becomes president if the president dies, resigns, or is removed. More importantly, it creates procedures for presidential disability, allowing presidents to temporarily transfer power during medical procedures, or the vice president and cabinet to declare the president unable to serve. It also provides that when the vice presidency is vacant, the president nominates a replacement confirmed by Congress. This ensures continuity of government and clear succession procedures. 26th Amendment, Voting Age, lowered to 18, 1971. Citizens 18 or older cannot be denied the vote based on age. The Vietnam War was the catalyst. Young men were drafted at 18, but couldn't vote for leaders sending them to war. Old enough to fight, old enough to vote became the rallying cry. Ratified in just 100 days, the fastest ever, It expanded the electorate by 11 million. It represents that citizenship responsibilities and rights should align. 27th Amendment, Congressional Pay Raises, 1992. Congressional pay changes can't take effect until after the next House election, ensuring voters can weigh in by re-electing or defeating members who voted for raises. Originally proposed by James Madison in 1789 as part of the Bill of Rights, it was forgotten for 200 years until a college student revived it in 1982. It was finally ratified in 1992, 203 years later, the longest ratification period ever. It prevents legislators from enriching themselves without electoral accountability.